There is a man most people have never heard of who understood the hidden law that governs human reality more completely than almost anyone who has ever lived, and then spent the last 2 decades of his life watching that same law destroy everything he had built. His name was Howard Hughes, and what happened to him is one of the most instructive, most haunting, and most personally relevant stories in the entire history of human psychology. Because the law that governed his life is governing yours too. Right now, whether you know it or not. Howard Hughes was born in 1905 in Houston, Texas, the only child of a father who had invented a revolutionary oil drilling bit and made a fortune from it, and a mother who was consumed by a terror of contamination and disease so profound that she inspected her son's body daily for signs of illness, kept him home from school repeatedly out of fear that other children would infect him, and communicated to him through 1,000 small daily acts that the world outside their home was fundamentally dangerous. Hughes inherited his father's brilliance and his mother's fear in equal measure, and the combination produced one of the most extraordinary and ultimately tragic minds of the 20th century. By age 30, he had directed Hollywood films, broken multiple world aviation speed records, founded a major airline, and was widely considered one of the most daring, visionary, unstoppable human beings alive. He moved through the world as if the rules that constrained other people simply did not apply to him, and in many ways, they didn't. So here is the question that this story is really asking. The question that I want you to hold in your mind across everything that follows. If Howard Hughes was this brilliant, this driven, this resourceful, and this free, what was the hidden law operating underneath all of it? And why did it eventually consume him completely? To understand what was actually happening inside Howard Hughes, you have to watch his behavior not just at its most dramatic peaks, but in its quieter, more revealing moments. Because the truth about any person is never in their headline performance. It is in the patterns they repeat when no one is writing about them. And Hughes's patterns, once you know what to look for, are unmistakable. From his earliest adult years, Hughes displayed what clinicians would later recognize as a profound and all-consuming need for control. Not just preference, need. The visceral, anxious kind of need that is not about wanting things a certain way, but about the feeling of existential danger that arises when they are not. He controlled the temperature of every room he entered. He controlled the exact positioning of objects on his desk with a precision that bordered on ritual. He issued written instructions to his staff that ran to dozens of pages covering the precise procedures for opening a can of food or handling a piece of paper in his presence. He would eat the same meal for months at a time, not out of indifference to food, but because the sameness felt safe in a way that variation never could. He dated some of the most celebrated women in America, but his relationships followed a pattern so consistent it could not have been accidental. Intense pursuit, total control of the other person's schedule and movements, then abrupt withdrawal or abandonment when intimacy became unavoidable. He fired employees who deviated from his instructions, even when their deviations produced better outcomes. He took legal action against business rivals with a relentlessness that far exceeded any rational calculation of self-interest. And as the years passed, the radius of what he could tolerate without anxiety shrank. The rituals multiplied. The controlled environments became smaller. The man who had once broken the world airspeed record in a plane he had designed himself eventually confined himself to a single darkened hotel room, unable to leave, unable to be touched, unable to allow anyone close enough to see what he had become. What happened? How does a man like that end up there? The answer requires us to go beneath the surface behavior, beneath the eccentricity and the compulsions and the paranoia, to the psychological architecture that was constructed in that Houston home, where a brilliant, anxious mother communicated to her beloved son that the world was full of invisible threats, that contamination was everywhere, that safety required vigilance, and that love meant watching constantly for signs of danger. Carl Jung spent his career mapping what he called the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything a person cannot integrate into their conscious identity. Everything they have been taught is unacceptable, frightening, or incompatible with survival. For Hughes, the shadow contained something devastating. It contained his fear. Not ordinary fear, but the specific, learned terror of a child who was told through daily embodied experience that the external world was contaminated and uncontrollable, and that the only possible response to this was hypervigilance, hypercontrol, and the construction of an environment small enough to manage completely. The man who became famous for daring, for flying faster than anyone had ever flown, for gambling enormous sums on films and businesses and aviation ventures, was not actually operating from freedom. He was operating from the other side of the same coin. The daring was a compensation, a way of proving to himself and the world that he was not afraid, that the terror his mother had installed in him was not running the show. And compensations of that magnitude always carry a cost, because the energy required to maintain them is enormous, and the shadow they are compensating for does not disappear just because you are brave enough to ignore it for a while. It waits, and it grows. And eventually, when the compensating behavior cannot be maintained any longer, when age or illness or circumstance removes the arena in which the overcoming could be performed, the shadow that was never integrated takes over the stage entirely. This is what psychologists call the return of the repressed, and it is one of the most reliable phenomena in all of clinical psychology. Research conducted by Harvard psychologist Daniel Wegner and his colleagues in the 1980s and 1990s demonstrated what became known as the ironic process theory. The finding that deliberate attempts to suppress a thought or feeling reliably increase its influence over behavior. Wegner's famous white bear experiment showed that people instructed not to think about a white bear thought about it more, not less, than people given no such instruction. The suppressed content does not go away. It goes underground. And underground it finds indirect expression through anxiety, through compulsion, through the specific fears and avoidances and rigid controls that come to dominate a person's life in ways they cannot fully explain even to themselves. Hughes spent his entire adult life suppressing the terror his mother had written into him. And the suppression worked brilliantly for decades. It fueled his ambition, his risk-taking, his extraordinary drive. But the terror was never actually gone. It was accumulating pressure behind a dam that grew more elaborate and more demanding every year. By the time he was in his 50s and 60s, the dam was the only project. Everything else had been abandoned to maintain it. This is the hidden law this story is really about. Not the law of attraction, not the law of success, not any of the comfortable formulas we like to apply to extraordinary lives. The law is this: whatever you refuse to face inside yourself will organize your external life around its own avoidance. And the more brilliant and resourceful you are, the more elaborate and convincing the organization will be, until the day it collapses under its own weight. Now I want you to pause for a moment, because this is the place in the story where it would be very easy to feel safely distant from Howard Hughes. He was extreme, after all. His mother was clinically anxious. His compulsions were diagnosable. His eventual confinement was the stuff of tabloids and tragedy. He is easy to observe from a distance with a mixture of fascination and relief, grateful that whatever your struggles are, they have not led you there. But here is what I need you to sit with honestly. The mechanism that operated in Howard Hughes operates in every human mind. The scale is different. The particular content of the shadow is different. The specific forms of compensation and control are different. But the law is the same. Think about the areas of your own life where you exercise a level of control that exceeds what the situation actually requires. The relationship you manage so carefully that genuine vulnerability never quite enters it. The career path you have optimized so precisely that genuine risk never quite threatens it. The self-image you maintain so consistently that genuine self-examination never quite disturbs it. Think about the things you are absolutely certain you are not. The qualities, the fears, the failures you have told yourself with total conviction are simply not part of who you are. Jung's greatest clinical insight was that whatever a person insists most forcefully they are not, is almost always precisely what they are most deeply. The vehemence of the denial is the map to the treasure, or in this case, to the wound. And the people who most angrily reject the suggestion that they might be afraid are, almost without exception, the ones most completely organized around their own fear. We are not talking about weakness here. We are not even talking about pathology in the clinical sense. We are talking about a universal human mechanism that is as natural as breathing and as necessary to understand as anything psychology has ever discovered. Robert Cialdini, in his research on influence and consistency, documented how powerfully human beings are motivated to maintain coherence between their self-image and their behavior, to the point where they will make objectively irrational choices rather than admit that the story they have been telling about themselves might need revision. We build identities, and then we protect them. We build compensations, and then we maintain them. We build the dam, and then we spend our lives making sure it holds. The question that Howard Hughes's life poses to each of us is not whether we have done this. We all have. The question is whether we are going to notice it before the room gets too small. So what do you actually do with this? Because the insight is only useful if it changes something. The first thing the research makes clear, and this comes from decades of work in Jungian analysis, in cognitive behavioral therapy, in acceptance and commitment therapy, and in the neuroscience of emotional regulation, is that the goal is not to eliminate the fear or the shadow or the wound. That is precisely the strategy that failed Howard Hughes. The goal is to stop organizing your life around its avoidance. There is an enormous difference between those two things, and the difference is everything. When you organize your life around avoiding fear, the fear grows in importance with every act of avoidance, because every time you reroute your path to stay away from it, you are sending your nervous system the signal that the thing being avoided is genuinely dangerous. You are confirming the threat with your own behavior. The avoidance is the maintenance program for the fear. What works instead is something far less dramatic and far more demanding. It is the practice of deliberate, contained exposure to the thing you have been organizing your life around, not touching, not dramatic confrontation, not forcing yourself into the deep end, contained, consensual, graduated proximity to the material you have been avoiding, and the discovery that you can be in its presence without being destroyed by it. Think about what that would look like in your own life. Not in Hughes's life, in yours. Where is the room getting smaller? Where are the rituals multiplying? Where is the radius of what you can comfortably inhabit shrinking? These are not rhetorical questions. They are diagnostic ones. Because the rooms we confine ourselves to are rarely physical. They are emotional. They are relational. They are the categories of experience we have quietly decided, without ever quite articulating it to ourselves, that we cannot afford to enter. The colleague whose success you cannot quite bring yourself to celebrate without a private, complicated feeling you have never examined. The conversation about your own needs you have been postponing for months or years. The creative work you have been protecting from ever being seen, because seen work can be judged, and judged work can confirm the fear you have been running from since before you had a name for it. These are the rooms, and they are getting smaller every year you do not enter them. The second thing the research tells us is that this work cannot be done entirely alone, and that the resistance to doing it with others is itself part of the mechanism. Hughes's tragedy was not just that he was afraid. It was that his fear had convinced him that allowing anyone close enough to help was more dangerous than the fear itself. This is the final, most elegant, and most devastating feature of the hidden law. It protects itself. It tells you that the cure is the disease. It tells you that the vulnerability required to break the pattern is precisely what cannot be afforded. And so the person who most needs genuine human connection retreats into the most elaborate isolation. The person who most needs to be seen constructs the most impenetrable performance. The person who most needs to admit the fear builds the tallest dam. If you recognize any of this in yourself, not at Hughes's extreme, but in the quieter, more socially acceptable versions, then the most important thing you can do is not to figure out how to fix it alone. It is to allow another person, even one person, to know one true thing about you that you have been protecting. Not everything, one thing. Because the dam that feels like it is keeping you safe is also keeping you sealed. And a life that is perfectly controlled is, in the end, a life that is not fully lived. Howard Hughes died in 1976, alone in a darkened room, his body so depleted by the long campaign of self-imprisonment that it weighed 90 pounds. The man who had once flown faster than any human being on Earth had, in his final years, barely left a single floor of a single hotel. The hidden law had completed its work. But here is the thing about laws. They apply in both directions. The same law that organizes a life around the avoidance of a wound can, once understood, organize a life around its honest examination. The same intelligence that built the most elaborate compensations can be redirected toward the most honest self-inquiry. The same drive that fueled every extraordinary achievement can find its way to the most important project of all. Not the project of becoming more impressive, but the project of becoming more whole. Hughes's story is a warning, but it is also, in the most uncomfortable and generous way, an invitation. The question it leaves us with is not, what was wrong with him? The question is, what rooms are you not entering? And how much of your life is currently organized around not entering them? Sit with that question tonight, not to answer it immediately, just to let it in. Because that, it turns out, is where everything begins to change. If this is the kind of conversation that makes something move in you, the kind that leaves you with a question rather than a comfortable conclusion, then you already know this is where you belong. The mind is the most complex and most important territory any of us will ever explore. And the exploration is always worth it.